Hey, beautiful souls. Before we dive into this absolutely jaw-dropping story of betrayal and the sweetest revenge you've ever heard, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you're going to want to follow every twist and turn of what happens next. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. This story is going to shake you to your core. They say the heart can only break so many times before it turns to stone. I used to think that was just a saying, something dramatic people said in movies. But I can tell you the exact moment mine crystallized into something cold, hard, and utterly unforgiving. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and my son Brandon was standing in my kitchen, his face flushed with wine and righteous indignation, pointing his finger at me like I was some stranger who'd wronged him. You know what, Mom? Sometimes I wish Vivian had raised me instead of you. At least then I would have learned what real class looks like. Vivian, his mother-in-law. The woman who swooped into our lives 3 years ago when Brandon married her daughter Skylar, bringing with her designer handbags, expensive perfume, and the kind of polished confidence that comes from never having to choose between groceries and the electric bill. The words hung in the air between us like poison gas. My son, my baby boy who I'd raised alone after his father abandoned us when Brandon was just 4 years old, stood there waiting for my reaction, probably expecting me to cry, to beg, to crumble the way I always had when he pushed too far. Instead, something inside me simply turned off, like a switch being flipped. The maternal desperation, the endless forgiveness, the willingness to accept any crumb of affection he threw my way, it all just stopped. Well, I said quietly, setting down the dish towel I'd been holding, that's certainly an interesting perspective. He blinked, clearly thrown by my calm response. Mom, I didn't mean… Oh, I think you meant exactly what you said, Brandon. And you know what? You're absolutely right. Vivian probably would have done a much better job. My name is Amelia Bennett, and I'm 68 years old. For the past 64 years, I've been Brandon's mother, protector, provider, and biggest supporter. I worked 3 jobs to put him through college. I mortgaged my house to help him start his business. I babysat his children every weekend while he and Skylar took their couples retreats and wine tours. But that night, standing in my modest kitchen in Cedar Falls, Iowa, I realized I was done being his mother. Because he'd made it crystal clear that he didn't want me to be. What Brandon didn't know, what he was about to find out, was that underneath this small-town grandmother exterior lived a woman who'd survived poverty, abandonment, and decades of disrespect with her dignity intact. And that woman? She was about to teach him exactly what happens when you bite the hand that's been feeding you your entire life. See, my dear boy had gotten comfortable in his success, comfortable enough to forget that his self-made empire was built on a foundation of my sacrifices. He'd forgotten that when you disrespect the person who gave you everything, there's usually a reckoning coming. And mine was going to be biblical. Let me paint you a picture of my relationship with Brandon before that October night, because you need to understand how deep this betrayal cut. Brandon James Bennett came into this world on a snowy February morning in 1986, screaming at the top of his lungs and gripping my finger with surprising strength. His father, Derek, took one look at this tiny, demanding human and decided fatherhood wasn't for him. He was gone before Brandon's first birthday, leaving behind nothing but a forwarding address in California and a pile of unpaid bills. So it was just me and my baby boy against the world. I was 24 years old, working as a cashier at the local grocery store, living in a cramped apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. But I had dreams for us, plans that stretched far beyond Cedar Falls. I worked mornings at the grocery store, afternoons cleaning offices, and evenings doing data entry from home while Brandon slept. Every penny went toward his future. Better clothes so he wouldn't be teased at school, extracurricular activities so he could discover his talents, tutoring when math became difficult in middle school. When Brandon was 8, I finally saved enough for a down payment on a small house in the better part of town. Nothing fancy, a modest two-bedroom ranch with a postage stamp yard, but it was ours. Brandon had his own room, painted blue with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that I put up myself, standing on a wobbly stepladder at midnight after my last shift. High school brought new challenges. Brandon wanted name-brand everything: shoes, clothes, electronics. His classmates' parents were doctors and lawyers and business owners. I was still cleaning their offices, but I made sure my son never felt less than. I picked up weekend shifts, sold my grandmother's jewelry, took out loans I'm still paying off. When he made varsity basketball, I was there for every game, cheering louder than anyone else in those bleachers. When he needed a car for his junior year, I gave him mine and took the bus to work. When prom rolled around, I worked overtime for 2 months to afford his tuxedo rental and his date's corsage. College was where things really got expensive. Brandon had his heart set on Northwestern University in Chicago, a prestigious school with a price tag that made my head spin. His guidance counselor suggested community college first, then transferring. But my son wanted what he wanted, and I'd never been able to deny him anything that I took out a second mortgage on our house. I sold my mother's antique furniture, the only valuable things I owned. I worked 7 days a week for 4 years, living on ramen noodles and generic brand everything while sending my son $800 a month for expenses. When he called home, it was usually to ask for more money. Books were more expensive than expected. He needed a laptop for his classes, his roommate was taking him on a ski trip, and he didn't want to be left out. I said yes to everything. Every single time. Brandon graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and immediately landed a job at a marketing firm in Chicago. I was so proud I cried during his graduation ceremony, thinking about all those years of sacrifice finally paying off. He was going to have the life I'd never been able to give myself. For a while, things were good between us. He called every Sunday, sent flowers on Mother's Day, visited for holidays. When he met Skylar during his 3rd year at the marketing firm, I was thrilled. She was beautiful, educated, from a good family. Everything I wanted for my son. The wedding was beautiful and expensive. Vivian Reynolds, Skylar's mother, had very specific ideas about what her daughter's wedding should look like. The venue, the flowers, the menu, everything had to be perfect. The cost was staggering, but when Brandon asked if I could help with the expenses, I couldn't say no. I dipped into my retirement savings and contributed $25,000 toward the wedding of his dreams. Vivian barely acknowledged my contribution. At the wedding, she introduced herself to people as the mother of the bride, while I was simply Brandon's mother, if I was introduced at all. She wore a designer gown that cost more than I made in 6 months, while I wore a dress from JCPenney that I'd hidden the price tag from because I was embarrassed by how little it cost, but I swallowed my discomfort because Brandon was happy. That's all that mattered. After the wedding, things began to change. Brandon's calls became less frequent, his visits shorter. When he and Skylar had their first child, Madison, I was over the moon. Finally, I was going to be a grandmother. But my excitement was quickly tempered by the realization that I was expected to be helpful, not involved. I babysat Madison every weekend so Brandon and Skylar could have couple time. I bought her clothes, toys, books, anything my granddaughter needed. But when it came to important moments, first steps, first words, first day of preschool, I was rarely included. Those milestones were captured and shared with Vivian, who had suddenly become Grandma Viv, while I remained simply Amelia. When their second child, Cooper, was born 2 years later, the pattern was even more pronounced. I was the free babysitter, the emergency contact when their regular childcare fell through, the one who could be counted on to drop everything when they needed help. But I wasn't the grandmother they bragged about to their friends. That honor belonged to Vivian, with her expensive gifts and exotic vacations and connections to the right people in the right places. The final insult came last year when Brandon decided to start his own marketing consultancy. It was a huge risk, leaving his stable corporate job to go out on his own. But he had vision, he said. He had talent. He just needed startup capital. Mom, he said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls, I hate to ask, but I need a loan. Just temporary until the business gets off the ground. Maybe $50,000. My entire life savings, plus what little was left in my retirement account. I was 67 years old, working part-time at the library because my Social Security wasn't enough to cover my expenses. $50,000 was more money than I could possibly spare. Of course, sweetheart, I heard myself saying, whatever you need. I liquidated everything. My savings, my retirement accounts, even took out a loan against my house. I gave my son his dream, and he took it with barely a thank you, like he was entitled to my sacrifice. His business took off almost immediately. Within 6 months, he was pulling in six-figure contracts, hiring employees, moving into a fancy office space in downtown Chicago. Success suited him well. Expensive suits, luxury car, a house in the suburbs that was featured in a local magazine. Did he pay me back? Of course not. When I gently brought it up during one of our phone calls, he got defensive. Mom, you know I'm good for it. The business is doing well, but I have overhead, employees to pay, a family to support. As soon as things stabilize, things never stabilized enough for him to remember his debt to me. But they were stable enough for him and Skylar to take a 3-week European vacation last summer, posting photos from Paris and Rome while I worked extra shifts at the library to pay my electric bill. Which brings us back to that October evening when my successful, ungrateful son stood in my kitchen and told me he wished another woman had raised him. The conversation had started innocently enough. I'd made his favorite dinner, pot roast with vegetables, mashed potatoes, apple pie for dessert. The same meal I'd made for his birthday every year since he was 5. Brandon had driven down from Chicago for the weekend, one of his increasingly rare visits home. Over dinner, I'd mentioned that maybe it was time for him to start thinking about paying back the loan I'd given him for his business. Not demanding it, not setting a deadline, just gently bringing up the topic. His response was immediate and harsh. God, Mom, you're always bringing up money. Can't we have one meal without you making me feel guilty about something? I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to make him feel guilty, that I was just struggling financially and could use some help. That's when he'd exploded, telling me I was manipulative, that I always made everything about money, that I didn't understand the pressures he was under. And then came the words that changed everything. You know what, Mom? Sometimes I wish Vivian had raised me instead of you. At least then I would have learned what real class looks like. Real class. As if working 3 jobs to keep him fed and clothed was somehow beneath him. As if sacrificing my entire life for his success was evidence of my failure as a mother. That night, after Brandon stormed out and drove back to Chicago, I sat in my kitchen and made a decision. If my son wanted Vivian to be his mother, then that's exactly what he was going to get. He just wasn't going to like the way I made it happen. The morning after Brandon's declaration, I woke up feeling strangely peaceful. For the first time in decades, I wasn't worried about what my son needed, what he expected from me, or how I could make his life easier. Instead, I was focused on something entirely different. Information. You see, when you've spent your whole life putting someone else first, you develop certain skills. You become observant. You pay attention to details. You remember things that other people forget. And you learn how to be invisible when you need to be. I'd been watching Vivian Reynolds for 3 years, studying her the way a scientist studies a specimen. Not out of malice, at least not initially, but out of curiosity. What made her so special? What did she have that I lacked? Why did my son and daughter-in-law worship at her feet while treating me like hired help? Now I was going to put that knowledge to use. Vivian Reynolds was 62 years old, a real estate agent specializing in luxury properties in the Chicago suburbs. She drove a white BMW, carried designer handbags, and never left the house without perfect makeup and carefully styled hair. She lived in a sprawling colonial in Winnetka with her husband Richard, a semi-retired investment banker who spent most of his time playing golf at their country club. But here's what most people didn't know about Perfect Vivian. Her success was built on a foundation of lies, shortcuts, and other people's money. I'd started my investigation casually, the way any concerned mother might look into her son's new family. Social media made it easy. Vivian loved posting photos of her expensive lifestyle, her real estate achievements, her perfect family moments with Skylar and the grandchildren. But social media also revealed inconsistencies. The timeline of her career didn't quite add up. The luxury lifestyle seemed to exceed what a real estate agent, even a successful one, could afford. And there were gaps in her history, periods where she seemed to disappear from public records entirely. I did what any self-respecting woman would do. I hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus Thompson, and he came highly recommended by a friend whose ex-husband had tried to hide assets during their divorce. Marcus was discreet, thorough, and surprisingly affordable for someone with his reputation. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked during our initial meeting at a coffee shop in nearby Waterloo. "The truth," I said simply. "About Vivian Reynolds. I want to know who she really is, where her money really comes from, and if there's anything in her past that doesn't match the image she projects." Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't ask for details. "That'll take some time. Background investigations are thorough, but they're not quick." "I have time," I assured him, "and I have a feeling this is going to be worth the wait." While Marcus worked his magic, I conducted my own investigation. I started spending more time in Chicago, visiting Brandon and the grandchildren, making myself useful in ways that allowed me to observe Vivian's world up close. I offered to babysit Madison and Cooper more often, which meant spending time in Brandon and Skylar's house, where Vivian was a frequent visitor. I listened to her phone conversations, paid attention to her interactions with other people, noted the inconsistencies in her stories. Vivian loved to talk about her success in real estate, but the numbers never quite added up. She claimed to be one of the top agents in her firm, but when I discreetly checked the public records of recent high-end sales in her area, her name appeared far less frequently than she implied. She also loved to talk about her family's wealth, dropping casual mentions of investments and trust funds and inherited properties. But when pressed for details, she always changed the subject or became vague about specifics. Most interesting of all was her relationship with Richard. In public, they presented as a devoted couple, but I noticed the strain around the edges. The way he stiffened when she mentioned expensive purchases. The way she deflected when he asked about her business expenses. The separate credit cards, the separate bank accounts, the way they seemed to be living parallel lives rather than a shared one. After 6 weeks, Marcus called with his preliminary findings. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I think you're going to want to see this in person." We met at the same coffee shop where we'd had our initial conversation. Marcus slid a thick manila folder across the table, his expression serious. "Before you open that," he said, "I want you to understand that what you're about to read is going to change some relationships. Are you sure you want to proceed?" I thought about Brandon's words, about the years of sacrifice and disrespect, about being relegated to second-class status in my own son's life. "I'm sure," I said, opening the folder. The first document was a credit report that made my eyes widen. Vivian Reynolds was drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out, multiple mortgages on the Winnetka house, car loans that were underwater. Her total debt exceeded $800,000, while her verifiable income from real estate commissions barely covered the minimum payments. The second document was even more interesting. A bankruptcy filing from 15 years ago, when Vivian was still married to her first husband. She'd apparently accumulated massive debts through gambling and bad investments, ultimately forcing them into Chapter 7 bankruptcy that wiped out everything they owned. But the real bombshell was in the third document, a criminal background check that revealed 2 arrests for embezzlement, both dismissed due to technicalities and plea bargains that require restitution and community service. She's been living beyond her means for years, Marcus explained quietly. The luxury lifestyle, the expensive gifts for your family, it's all financed through credit and what appears to be some creative accounting at her real estate firm. I flipped through more documents, each one more damaging than the last. Unpaid taxes, liens on properties, a pattern of financial irresponsibility that stretched back decades. There's more, Marcus said, sliding another folder across the table. This one's about her family background. The story Vivian told about her privileged upbringing was completely fabricated. She hadn't grown up wealthy in Lake Forest as she claimed. She'd grown up in a trailer park in Gary, Indiana, the daughter of a factory worker and a part-time waitress. Her real name wasn't even Vivian. It was Beverly Jean Kowalski, and she'd legally changed it when she moved to Chicago in her 20s. She's essentially created an entirely fictional identity, Marcus continued. The accent, the mannerisms, the stories about boarding school and family vacations in Europe, none of it's real. I sat back in my chair, processing the information. The woman my son held up as the epitome of class and sophistication was nothing but a fraud. A broke, desperate fraud who was apparently funding her lifestyle through a combination of debt and possibly illegal activities. What happens now? Marcus asked. I closed the folders and looked at him with a smile that probably would have frightened him if he'd known me better. Now, I said, I give my son exactly what he asked for. Armed with the truth about Vivian Reynolds, I began planning my revenge with the methodical precision of a military campaign. This wasn't going to be a single dramatic confrontation that would give Brandon the opportunity to explain away or minimize his betrayal. No, this was going to be a slow, careful dismantling of everything he thought he knew about his perfect mother-in-law and his own moral superiority. The first step was establishing credibility. I couldn't just show up with a folder full of documents and expect Brandon to believe me. He dismissed it as jealousy, as a desperate attempt to discredit the woman he preferred over his own mother. I needed independent verification, and I needed Brandon to discover at least some of the truth himself. I started by anonymously sending copies of Vivian's bankruptcy records to the managing broker at her real estate firm. Nothing dramatic. Just a plain manila envelope with copies of the public documents and a note suggesting they might want to review their agents' financial stability. The real estate industry takes financial responsibility seriously. Agents who are drowning in debt are considered liability risks. Desperate people make desperate choices, and desperate choices often involve other people's money. Within a week, Vivian found herself under internal investigation by her own company. The second domino was more personal. I created a fake social media account and began following several of Vivian's close friends and colleagues. Through careful observation of their posts and interactions, I identified the biggest gossips in her social circle. Then I began dropping little hints, innocent questions about whether anyone else had noticed inconsistencies in Vivian's stories, casual mentions of public records that didn't quite match her claims about her background. I never accused her of anything directly. I just planted seeds of doubt and let human nature do the rest. In a social circle built on status and appearances, questions about authenticity spread like wildfire. But the real masterstroke came when I decided to target Vivian's relationship with Richard. See, Marcus's investigation had revealed something interesting about their marriage. Richard wasn't as wealthy as Vivian claimed. He was comfortable, certainly, but not rich enough to support the lifestyle they were projecting. Most of their expensive purchases were being made with credit cards and loans that Vivian was managing, often without Richard's full knowledge. Richard Reynolds was a proud man who valued financial responsibility above almost everything else. He'd spent his career in investment banking, building a reputation for conservative, careful money management. The idea that his wife was financing their lifestyle through debt would horrify him, if he knew about it. So I made sure he found out. I sent Richard an anonymous letter with copies of some of Vivian's credit card statements and loan documents. Nothing illegal. These were documents that any spouse would have a right to see. The letter was simple and direct. Thought you should know what your wife has been doing with your credit and your name. The results were immediate and devastating. Richard confronted Vivian, who tried to downplay the extent of their debt and blame the spending on business expenses and temporary cash flow issues. But the numbers were too large to explain away, and Richard was too experienced with financial matters to be fooled. Within days, their marriage was in crisis. Vivian was sleeping in the guest room, Richard was consulting divorce attorneys, and their perfect family facade was crumbling. Meanwhile, I sat in my modest house in Cedar Falls, following the drama through social media posts and phone calls between Skylar and Brandon that I occasionally overheard when I was babysitting the grandchildren. I don't understand what's happening, Skylar confided to Brandon during one of these calls. Mom and Dad are barely speaking. Dad found out about some debts that Mom apparently hid from him, and now he's talking about legal separation. Maybe it's just a rough patch, Brandon replied, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. All marriages go through difficult times. It's not just the debt, Skylar continued. Dad hired some kind of investigator to look into Mom's business dealings. He's found things, irregularities that he's reporting to her real estate firm. I smiled as I listened from the kitchen where I was preparing snacks for Madison and Cooper. Phase 1 was working perfectly. The investigation Richard commissioned turned up additional evidence of Vivian's creative accounting practices. Nothing that would result in criminal charges. She was too smart for that, but enough to raise serious questions about her professional ethics and financial management. Her real estate firm placed her on administrative leave pending their own investigation. Her luxury car was repossessed when she missed 2 consecutive payments. The house in Winnetka was put up for sale as Richard moved to protect his credit and assets from his wife's financial irresponsibility. But the most satisfying development came when Vivian, desperate to maintain her lifestyle and social standing, made a crucial mistake. She asked Brandon for money. Just a short-term loan, she explained during a family dinner at Brandon and Skylar's house. I was there, of course, babysitting the children while the adults talked in the living room. Until this misunderstanding with Richard gets sorted out and I can get back to work. I watched through the kitchen doorway as Brandon shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Skylar, who looked mortified by her mother's request. How much are we talking about? Brandon asked carefully. Maybe 50,000? I know it's a lot, but I'm good for it. You know I am.
$52,000.
The same amount Brandon had borrowed from me and never repaid. The irony was delicious. Vivian, Brandon said slowly, I don't think I can do that right now. The business is doing well, but I have my own overhead to consider. It was almost word for word the same excuse he'd given me when I'd asked about repaying his loan. Listening to him turn down his precious mother-in-law using the exact same reasoning he'd used to dismiss my financial needs was more satisfying than I'd expected. Vivian's carefully composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the desperation underneath. But Brandon, I thought we had the kind of relationship where family helps family. We do, he said quickly. But 50,000 is it's a lot of money. As I listened to this exchange, I realized that my plan was working even better than I'd hoped. Brandon was beginning to see a side of Vivian that he'd never seen before, the needy, desperate side that she'd kept hidden behind her facade of wealth and sophistication. The woman he'd held up as an example of real class was revealed to be just as financially vulnerable and dependent as the mother he'd rejected. The difference was that I had never asked him for anything until I was desperate, while Vivian was asking now that her carefully constructed lie was falling apart. But this was only the beginning. Brandon's awakening to Vivian's true nature was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. He'd hurt me deeply, publicly rejected everything I'd done for him, and declared that another woman should have raised him. Before I was finished, he was going to understand exactly what that choice really meant. And by the time he figured out who was behind Vivian's downfall, it would be far too late to stop what was coming next. The second phase of my plan was about to begin, and it was going to hit much closer to home. 3 months after Vivian's world began crumbling, I received a phone call that filled me with more satisfaction than I care to admit. It was Brandon, and for the first time in years, he sounded genuinely distressed. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with stress, "I need to talk to you about something. Can I come down this weekend?" "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, my tone warm and maternal despite the cold calculation running through my mind. "Is everything all right?" "It's complicated. Skylar's family situation is getting worse, and it's affecting our marriage. I just need some perspective from someone I trust." Someone he trusted. How interesting that I'd suddenly regained that status now that his perfect alternative mother figure was revealed to be a fraud. That Saturday, Brandon arrived looking haggard and defeated. The confident, successful businessman who'd stood in my kitchen months earlier declaring his preference for Vivian had been replaced by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. I made coffee and sat across from him at my kitchen table, the same table where he delivered his devastating pronouncement about wishing Vivian had raised him. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Tell me what's happening," I said gently, playing the concerned mother to perfection. Brandon ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was overwhelmed. "Vivian and Richard are getting divorced. It's ugly, Mom. Really ugly. Richard's forensic accountants found evidence that she's been hiding debt and forging his signature on loans. She might face criminal charges." I made appropriate sympathetic noises while internally celebrating this development. Richard's investigation had been even more thorough than I'd hoped. "But that's not the worst part," Brandon continued. "Skylar's been defending her mother, insisting that Richard's just being vindictive, that Vivian's done nothing wrong. She wants us to help Vivian financially, maybe let her move in with us temporarily." "And you don't want to do that?" I asked, though the answer was obvious from his expression. "Mom, I've seen the documents Richard's lawyers provided. Vivian's debt is astronomical. She's been living a complete lie for years. And now Skylar wants me to risk our family's financial security to bail out her mother, who apparently can't even be honest about her real name." I raised an eyebrow with practiced surprise. "Her real name?" "She changed it from Beverly Kowalski to Vivian Reynolds when she moved to Chicago. Made up this whole story about growing up wealthy when she actually grew up in a trailer park. Everything she told us about her background was a lie." Brandon looked at me with something approaching desperation. "I don't know what to do. If I refuse to help Vivian, Skylar says she'll never forgive me. But if I get involved in this mess, it could destroy everything I've worked for." I reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture of a loving mother comforting her troubled son. "What does your gut tell you?" "That Vivian is toxic, and I should stay as far away from her as possible. But Skylar can't see it. She's so angry about her parents' divorce that she's taking it out on me, saying I don't understand family loyalty." Family loyalty. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with irony that Brandon didn't even recognize. "Maybe," I said carefully, "this is a good time to think about what family loyalty really means. Who's been truly loyal to you throughout your life?" For a moment, something flickered in Brandon's eyes. A shadow of recognition, perhaps a memory of all the times I'd put his needs before my own. But it passed quickly, replaced by his immediate concerns. "I just wish Skylar could see what I see," he said. "Vivian's not the woman we thought she was." "People aren't always what they appear to be," I agreed. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal someone's true character." We talked for another hour, with me playing the role of supportive mother while Brandon vented his frustrations about his marriage, his in-laws, and his growing realization that the woman he'd idolized was nothing but smoke and mirrors. When he left that evening, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. "Thanks for listening, Mom. I forgot how good it feels to talk to someone who actually cares about what's best for me. After his car disappeared down my street, I sat in my living room and allowed myself a moment of pure, vindictive satisfaction. Phase 2 was complete. Brandon now saw Vivian exactly as she was: desperate, dishonest, and potentially dangerous to his family's well-being, but I wasn't finished. Not even close. Over the next few weeks, I monitored the situation through my network of information sources. Skylar and Brandon's marriage was deteriorating rapidly as they fought about how to handle her mother's crisis. Vivian, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly desperate as her legal and financial problems mounted. That's when I implemented Phase 3, the revelation that I sent Brandon a package with no return address. Inside was a complete dossier on Vivian Reynolds, aka Beverly Jean Kowalski, compiled by Marcus Thompson. Every detail of her fraudulent past, every lie she'd told, every manipulation she'd used to create her false identity. But most importantly, I included financial records showing exactly how she'd been funding her lifestyle through a complex scheme of credit manipulation and what appear to be client trust fund violations at her real estate firm. The package also contained something else: copies of text messages between Vivian and Skylar discussing how to manipulate Brandon into providing financial support. Messages where Vivian coached her daughter on what to say, how to play on Brandon's emotions, how to make him feel guilty for not helping family. "You have to make him understand that this is about loyalty," one of Vivian's messages read. "Rich men like Brandon think they're above family obligations, but you have to remind him where he came from. Make him feel guilty about his success." Another message was even more damaging. "If he won't help willingly, you might need to threaten the marriage. Men like Brandon are terrified of losing their perfect family image. Use that fear." The final message in the chain was the most revealing. "Remember, sweetheart, we trained him to be the perfect son-in-law. Now it's time to collect on that investment." Trained him? Like he was a pet, not a person. That I included no note with the package, no explanation of how I'd obtained the information. I wanted Brandon to discover the truth and draw his own conclusions about what it meant. His phone call came 2 days later. "Mom," he said, his voice cold and controlled in a way I'd never heard before. "Did you send me a package?" "What kind of package?" I asked innocently. "Documents about Vivian. Text messages between her and Skylar. Information about things they've been planning." "Why would I have access to that kind of information?" A long pause. "Because this is the kind of detailed investigation that costs money, and right now you're the only person I can think of who would have both the motivation and the resources to do something like this." I was impressed despite myself. Brandon was smarter than I'd given him credit for. "If I had done something like that," I said carefully, "what would be your reaction?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'd want to know why. Because sometimes the people we love need protection from their own poor judgment. And sometimes the truth is painful, but necessary." "How long have you known?" "About what specifically?" "About all of it. Vivian's background, her financial problems, the way she's been manipulating our family." I considered lying, maintaining the fiction of innocence. But Brandon deserved the truth, at least part of it. "I started investigating Vivian after you told me you wished she had raised you instead of me. I wanted to understand what made her so superior to the woman who actually sacrificed everything for your success." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, what have I done?" "You made a choice," I replied simply. "You chose her over me based on appearances rather than substance. Now you know what that choice really meant."
I'm sorry.
"God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I was angry, and I said something terrible, and you've been protecting me even after I hurt you." "Yes," I said. "I have. Because that's what mothers do. We protect our children, even when they don't deserve it. How can I make this right?" And there it was. The question I'd been waiting for. The moment when Brandon finally understood the magnitude of his betrayal and was ready to face the consequences. But I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. He'd hurt me too deeply, rejected me too completely, for a simple apology to suffice. I don't think you can make this right, Brandon, I said quietly. Some things, once broken, can't be repaired. What do you mean? I mean that you spent years taking me for granted, borrowing money you never intended to repay, treating me like hired help while elevating a woman who turned out to be a complete fraud. And when I gently suggested you might want to start paying back what you owed me, you told me you wished someone else had raised you. I was angry. No, I interrupted. You were honest. In that moment of anger, you revealed exactly how you really feel about me, about everything I've done for you. You can't take that back with an apology. I could hear him crying now, and part of me, the maternal part that had been trained through decades of conditioning, wanted to comfort him. But the woman who'd been betrayed and dismissed was stronger. What happens now? He asked. Now you get exactly what you asked for. You wanted Vivian to be your mother? Well, she's going to need a son to take care of her. Her marriage is over, her career is ruined, and she's facing potential criminal charges. She needs someone to support her financially and emotionally through this crisis. Mom, please. I'm not your mother anymore, Brandon. Remember? You wished someone else had raised you. Consider that wish granted. I hung up before he could respond. The aftermath of my conversation with Brandon was everything I'd hoped for and more. Within hours, he'd confronted Skylar with the evidence of her mother's manipulation, leading to the biggest fight of their marriage. Skylar, faced with undeniable proof of her mother's scheming, was forced to choose between defending an indefensible position and acknowledging the truth about who Vivian really was. She chose denial, of course. In families built on dysfunction, the truth is often too painful to accept. You hired someone to spy on my mother, she screamed at Brandon, according to the account he gave me in a series of increasingly desperate voicemails. You invaded our privacy. You violated our trust. Your mother was manipulating us. Brandon shot back. She coached you on exactly what to say to make me feel guilty, how to threaten our marriage if I didn't give her money. She called me an investment that it was time to collect on. But Skylar was too deep in her mother's web to see the truth. She'd been raised by Vivian, shaped by her values and her worldview. The idea that her sophisticated, successful mother was actually a fraud was impossible for her to accept. The marriage imploded within a week. Skylar filed for divorce, taking Madison and Cooper to stay with friends while the legal proceedings began. She demanded half of everything Brandon owned, including the business he'd built with my money. Her lawyers painted him as a controlling husband who deliberately sabotaged her relationship with her mother out of jealousy and spite. Brandon, meanwhile, was discovering what it meant to navigate a crisis without the safety net I'd always provided. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly on his own. No mother to bail him out, no mother-in-law to smooth the way, no wife to handle the emotional labor of maintaining family relationships. He called me repeatedly, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly frantic as his world collapsed around him. Mom, please call me back. I know I hurt you, but I need help. Skylar's lawyers are claiming I have hidden assets. They're trying to freeze my business accounts. I don't know what to do. Mom, Vivian showed up at my office today demanding money. She says I owe it to Skylar and the kids to support her through this difficult time. She's threatening to tell people that I abandoned my family when they needed me most. Mom, I can't afford the lawyers I need for this divorce. Skylar's family has connections, money for the best attorneys. I'm going to lose everything, including my kids. Please, I'm begging you to help me. Each voicemail was more desperate than the last, but I didn't return his calls. Instead, I was busy implementing the final phase of my plan. You see, during my investigation into Vivian's background, I discovered something interesting about Brandon's business. The contracts he was so proud of, the success that had made him feel superior to his small-town mother, much of it was built on connections Vivian had provided through her real estate network. Wealthy clients who needed marketing services for their businesses, property developers who required consultation on demographic targeting, investors looking for someone to handle their promotional campaigns. Vivian had steered them all to Brandon, positioning herself as the bridge between her son-in-law's services and her affluent social circle. Now that Vivian's reputation was in ruins and her connections were distancing themselves from the scandal, Brandon's client base was evaporating. Companies didn't want to be associated with the marketing consultant whose mother-in-law was facing fraud charges. The wealthy investors who'd trusted Vivian's recommendation were pulling their contracts, afraid that Brandon might be implicated in her schemes. Within a month, Brandon's business lost 70% of its revenue. He was forced to lay off employees, downsize his office, and take on smaller, less prestigious clients just to stay afloat. But the final blow came when Vivian, desperate and facing mounting legal bills, decided to throw Brandon under the bus to save herself. She contacted the prosecutor handling her case and suggested that Brandon had been complicit in her financial schemes. According to her new story, he'd known about her debt problems and had helped her hide assets from Richard during their divorce proceedings. She claimed he'd received kickbacks from some of the questionable real estate deals she'd been involved in. None of it was true, of course. But Vivian was a skilled manipulator, and she knew how to make her lies sound convincing. She had documentation of money that had flowed between them, the loans she'd requested, the business referrals she'd provided, and she was spinning it all as evidence of a conspiracy. Brandon found himself under investigation by both federal authorities and the state licensing board that governed his industry. His business accounts were frozen pending the investigation. His professional reputation was destroyed. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built with my money and Vivian's connections, was crumbling. And through it all, I watched from my modest house in Cedar Falls, feeling a satisfaction so complete it was almost spiritual. This was what Brandon had chosen when he rejected me for Vivian. This was the real class he'd preferred. A criminal investigation, a destroyed marriage, estranged children, and financial ruin. All because he believed that appearances mattered more than substance. The irony was perfect. In trying to escape what he saw as the limitations of his working-class mother, he'd aligned himself with someone whose criminal background and fraudulent lifestyle made my honest poverty look noble by comparison. But I wasn't finished with him yet. There was one more lesson Brandon needed to learn, one final truth about what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. 6 months after Brandon's world began its spectacular collapse, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Madison, my 13-year-old granddaughter, standing on my porch with tears streaming down her face and a backpack slung over her shoulder. "Grandma Amelia," she said, using the formal title that had always stung a little compared to Skylar's children calling Vivian Grammy Viv. "Can I come in? Please?" I opened the door wider and pulled her into a hug, my heart breaking despite everything that had happened. Whatever sins her parents had committed, Madison was innocent. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong? Where's your mother?" Madison collapsed onto my couch, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "She's at Grammy, Viv's apartment. They're always there now, and they hate Dad, and they say horrible things about him all the time. Mom says I'm not allowed to see him anymore, but I miss him so much." Through her tears, Madison told me about the war zone her life had become. Skylar, bitter about the divorce and angry about her reduced circumstances, had poisoned Madison and Cooper against their father. She'd moved in with Vivian in a cramped apartment across town, the only place Vivian could afford after losing the house in Winnetka. "Grammy Viv is different now," Madison said, wiping her nose with the tissue I handed her. "She's angry all the time and she drinks too much, and she says mean things about everyone. She tells Mom that Dad ruined our family because he was jealous of our success. I listened with growing anger as Madison described the toxic environment Skylar and Vivian had created. The constant complaints about money, the bitter recriminations about Brandon's betrayal, the way they'd turned the children into weapons in their war against him. "I just want my family back," Madison whispered. "I want my dad back. But Mom says if I talk to him, she'll send me to live with Grammy Viv's sister in Indiana, where I won't see any of my friends anymore." This was a complication I hadn't anticipated. In my quest for revenge against Brandon, I'd forgotten that his children would be caught in the crossfire. Madison's pain was real and immediate, and despite everything that had happened, I couldn't ignore it. "Does your dad know you're here?" I asked. Madison shook her head. "I took the bus. I had your address from when I used to send you birthday cards." Used to send. Past tense. Because Skylar had stopped allowing the children to maintain contact with me after the divorce proceedings began, I called Brandon immediately. "Madison is here," I said without preamble when he answered. "She's safe, but she's upset. You need to come get her." "Oh God, Madison." His voice was filled with relief and terror. "I've been looking for her for hours. Skylar called the police and accused me of kidnapping her when she didn't come home from school. She came here on her own. Brandon, we need to talk about what's happening to these children." "I know. I've been trying to get custody, but Skylar's lawyers are claiming I'm an unfit parent because of the investigation. Every time I try to see Madison and Cooper, Skylar finds a way to block it." An hour later, Brandon arrived at my door, looking like a broken man. He'd lost weight, aged years in the span of months, and when he saw Madison, he pulled her into a hug so desperate it made my chest tight. "I'm sorry, Daddy," Madison sobbed. "I know I'm not supposed to talk to you, but I missed you so much." "You have nothing to be sorry for, baby girl. Nothing at all." Watching them together, I felt the first crack in the wall of ice I'd built around my heart. This was my son, my granddaughter, my family, broken and hurting because of choices I'd influenced. But then I remembered Brandon's words from that October night, and the ice reformed. He'd made his choice when he wished Vivian had raised him. Everything that followed was simply the natural consequence of that choice. "Brandon," I said quietly, "we need to discuss custody arrangements." He looked up at me with desperate hope. "Will you help me? I know I don't deserve it, but Madison and Cooper need stability. They need to be away from Vivian's influence. What are you offering?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Brandon studied my face, looking for some hint of the unconditional maternal love that had always been there before. "What do you want?" he asked carefully. "I want acknowledgement. I want you to publicly admit that you were wrong about me, wrong about Vivian, and wrong about the choices you made. I want you to pay back every penny you owe me, with interest. And I want you to understand that this help comes with conditions." "What conditions?" "You do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, for as long as I'm helping you. No questions, no arguments, no attempts to minimize or rationalize your past behavior. You made me irrelevant in your life, Brandon. Now you get to experience what it's like to be completely dependent on someone else's goodwill." Brandon's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old arrogance. But then he looked at Madison, still clinging to him, and the fight went out of him. "Okay," he said quietly. "Whatever you want."
Good.
"Then here's what's going to happen. You're going to hire the lawyer I choose, using money I'll loan you at market interest rates. You're going to follow my strategy for winning custody, which will involve exposing every detail of Skylar and Vivian's manipulation and dysfunction. And you're going to do it all while acknowledging that I'm the only reason you have any hope of getting your children back." It was a complete reversal of our lifelong dynamic. For once, Brandon needed me more than I needed him. For once, I held all the power in our relationship. "There's something else," I continued. Part of winning this custody battle is going to involve presenting yourself as a stable, responsible parent with strong family support. That means you're going to have to move back to Cedar Falls, live in my guest room, and allow me to play the role of loving grandmother who's helping her son get back on his feet. Brandon's expression was carefully controlled, but I could see the humiliation in his eyes. The successful businessman who'd thought himself too good for his small-town mother was going to have to move back into her house like a teenager who'd failed to launch. For how long? Until I decide you've learned your lesson about family loyalty and respect. Could be months, could be years. That's entirely up to you. Madison looked back and forth between us, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Does this mean Daddy's coming home? She asked hopefully. Yes, sweetheart, I said, smiling at her while keeping my eyes locked on Brandon's. Daddy's coming home. And this time, he's going to stay until I say he can leave. Moving Brandon back into my house was like performing surgery on our relationship while the patient was awake. Every interaction was loaded with the weight of his betrayal and my revenge. Every conversation a reminder of how completely our roles had reversed. His old bedroom had been converted into my craft room years ago, so I made him sleep in the guest room, the smallest bedroom in the house, with a single bed and furniture I'd bought at garage sales. It was a far cry from the luxury he'd grown accustomed to, and I made sure he felt every bit of that downgrade. This is temporary, he said on his first night, standing in the doorway with a single suitcase and a box of belongings from his former life. Everything is temporary, Brandon. Your marriage was temporary. Your business success was temporary. Your preference for Vivian over me was temporary. The question is whether you'll learn anything from this temporary arrangement. The custody battle that followed was brutal and public in exactly the way I'd planned. My lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Martinez who specialized in family law and had a reputation for taking no prisoners, systematically dismantled Skylar and Vivian's credibility. We subpoenaed Vivian's financial records, exposing the full extent of her debt and fraudulent activities. We presented evidence of her criminal background, her pattern of lies and manipulation, her use of Skylar and the children as weapons against Brandon. Most damaging of all, we played recordings of Vivian's conversations with Skylar, strategizing about how to turn the children against their father and maximize the financial damage from the divorce. She's teaching my granddaughter to hate her own father, I told the court during my testimony, playing the role of concerned grandmother to perfection. She's using these children as tools in her vendetta against my son, and it's destroying their emotional well-being. The judge was clearly disgusted by what he heard. Skylar, faced with overwhelming evidence of her mother's manipulation and her own complicity, began to crack under pressure. During cross-examination, she admitted that Vivian had coached her on what to say to Brandon, how to manipulate his emotions, how to use the threat of losing his children to control him. But I was just trying to protect my family, she insisted, tears streaming down her face. Brandon turned against my mother. He hired investigators to spy on us. He destroyed our trust. Mrs. Reynolds, Rebecca said calmly, did your mother tell you to say that just now? Is this another script she provided? The question broke something in Skylar. She looked across the courtroom at Vivian, who was watching with cold calculation, and something in her expression changed. I don't know anymore, she whispered. I don't know what's real and what she told me to think. The judge awarded Brandon primary custody of both children, with Skylar receiving supervised visitation rights pending completion of family counseling. Vivian was ordered to have no contact with Madison and Cooper until she completed psychological evaluation and treatment. IT was a complete victory, exactly what I'd orchestrated. But watching Skylar's complete breakdown in the courtroom, seeing the children's confusion and pain, I felt something I hadn't expected, a flicker of doubt about what I'd set in motion. That night, as Brandon sat at my kitchen table reviewing the custody paperwork, I studied his face for signs of gratitude, acknowledgement, some indication that he understood who had saved his family. "Thank you," he said quietly, not looking up from the documents. "I know you didn't have to help me." "No, I didn't. I could have let you lose your children the same way you discarded me. Would that have been fair?" He finally looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my son's eyes. Genuine fear. Fear of me, of what I was capable of how completely I now controlled his life. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Of course." "Did you orchestrate all of this? Vivian's downfall, the investigation into her background, the evidence that destroyed her credibility." I considered lying, maintaining the fiction that I'd simply been protecting him from Vivian's manipulation. But Brandon deserved to know exactly who he was dealing with. "Yes," I said simply. "All of it." He stared at me for a long moment, processing the implications. "You destroyed my marriage. You ruined Skylar's relationship with her mother. You put my children through a traumatic custody battle. All because I said something hurtful when I was angry."
No, Brandon.
"I did all of that because you meant what you said when you were angry. The anger just made you honest about how you really felt about me. But the children are better off without Vivian's toxic influence, and you know it. Madison told me herself how awful things had become. I saved them from a grandmother who was teaching them to hate their father, and a mother who was willing to sacrifice their well-being for revenge." Brandon was quiet for a long time, turning his wedding ring around his finger, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you learn to be grateful for what you have instead of constantly wanting more. You learn to respect the people who've sacrificed for you instead of taking them for granted. You learn that family loyalty isn't just a phrase you use when you need something. And if I don't learn those lessons..." I smiled at him with maternal sweetness that didn't reach my eyes. "Then you'll discover that what I did to Vivian was gentle compared to what I can do to someone who really disappoints me." The message was clear. I owned him now. His children, his future, his ability to rebuild his life. It all depended on my continued goodwill. He could choose to learn from this experience and become the son I'd always wanted, or he could continue to take me for granted and face consequences that would make Vivian's destruction look like a gentle correction. Either way, he would never again make the mistake of thinking someone else could replace me in his life. Living with Brandon again, after everything that had happened, was like training a stubborn dog who'd forgotten his place in the pack hierarchy. Every day brought small tests of his submission, opportunities for him to demonstrate whether he'd truly learned his lesson or was simply biding his time until he could regain his independence. I started with simple requirements. He would cook breakfast for the family every morning, help Madison and Cooper with their homework every evening, and handle all the household maintenance I'd been doing myself for years. Nothing unreasonable, nothing he couldn't handle, but enough to remind him constantly that he was living in my house under my rules. The children adapted to their new living situation with the resilience of youth. Madison, now 14, seemed genuinely happy to be away from the toxic environment Skylar and Vivian had created. Cooper, at 11, was initially withdrawn but gradually began opening up as he realized he could mention his father without triggering an explosive reaction. "I like it here, Grandma Amelia," Madison told me one evening as we worked together in my garden. "It's quiet. Nobody's yelling all the time." "What was it like before?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the custody proceedings. Madison was quiet for a moment, carefully transplanting seedlings. "Grammy, Viv was always angry about money. She'd drink wine and cry about how Dad ruined everything, how he was selfish and ungrateful. Mom would get upset and say mean things about Dad, and then Cooper would cry, and then Grammy Viv would say we needed to be strong and not let Dad hurt us anymore." The picture she painted confirmed everything I'd suspected about the emotional manipulation Vivian had orchestrated. She'd weaponized the children's natural loyalty to their mother, turning their confusion about the divorce into anger against their father. "But Dad didn't hurt us," Madison continued, her voice small. "He just wasn't there anymore, and nobody would tell us why." I felt another crack in my armor of righteous anger. These children had been casualties in a war between adults, innocent victims of choices they couldn't understand. But I pushed the guilt aside. Everything I'd done had been necessary to save them from Vivian's influence and reunite them with their father. Brandon, meanwhile, was learning what it meant to live without the safety net of financial security he'd taken for granted. His business was slowly recovering from the scandal, but he was starting over with smaller clients and lower fees. The expensive lifestyle he'd enjoyed during his marriage was gone, replaced by the humbling reality of living paycheck to paycheck while paying child support and legal fees. "I need to find my own place," he told me one evening after the children were in bed. "This arrangement isn't sustainable long-term." "Why isn't it sustainable?" I asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. "Because I'm a grown man living in his mother's house. Because Madison and Cooper need stability, not the constant reminder that their father is dependent on their grandmother. Because this dynamic between us isn't healthy." I set down my knitting and looked at him directly. "What dynamic is that, exactly?" Brandon shifted uncomfortably. "You know what I mean. This power game we're playing. You holding my past mistakes over my head, me having to prove myself worthy of your help. It's not a normal mother-son relationship." "You're right," I agreed. "It's not normal. But then, it wasn't normal for you to publicly declare that you wished another woman had raised you. It wasn't normal for you to borrow $50,000 from your mother and never pay it back. It wasn't normal for you to treat me like hired help while elevating a criminal to the status of family matriarch. I've apologized for all of that. Apologizing and making amends are two different things, Brandon. You've said you're sorry, but you haven't demonstrated that you understand the full impact of your choices or that you're committed to changing your behavior. What would that demonstration look like?" I picked up my knitting again, considering my answer carefully. "It would look like you rebuilding your relationship with your children without any expectation that I'll continue to provide free childcare and household management. It would look like you paying back the money you owe me with interest, even if it takes years. It would look like you publicly acknowledging that the mother who raised you deserves more respect than the fraud who manipulated your family. And until I do those things, until you do those things, you live under my roof, follow my rules, and remember every day that your children's stability depends on my continued generosity." Brandon was quiet for a long time, absorbing the reality of his situation. He had no savings, no credit, no family support system other than me. His business was barely solvent, his reputation was still recovering from the scandal, and his ex-wife was living in near poverty with her disgraced mother. "This is about control," he said finally. "You're punishing me by making me completely dependent on you."
No, y correcte.
"I'm teaching you what dependency actually feels like. For 37 years, you've been dependent on me, my money, my support, my unconditional love. But you never recognized that dependency because I never made you feel it. I made your life easier without making you acknowledge what I was doing." I set my knitting aside and leaned forward. "Now you know exactly how much you need me, and you can never again take that for granted. This isn't punishment, Brandon. This is education." 3 months later, Brandon received an offer to relocate his business to Des Moines, where a former client was starting a development company and needed marketing support. It was a good opportunity, stable income, room for growth, a chance to rebuild his professional reputation in a new market. IT was also a test. "I want to take the job," he told me over dinner. "It's a solid opportunity, and the salary would be enough to rent a decent place for me and the kids." "That sounds wonderful," I said. "When would you start?" Brandon looked surprised by my easy acceptance. "Next month." "But, Mom, I want you to know that this isn't about running away from our situation here. I value what we've rebuilt together, and I want you to be part of our lives going forward. Of course you do. Because you've finally learned what happens when you don't value the people who matter most. The real test came when Brandon asked if I would consider moving to Des Moines as well, to help with the children and maintain our newly repaired relationship. It was a reasonable request. The children had grown attached to our routine, and I was now their primary caregiver while he traveled for work. But it was also an opportunity for me to demonstrate that our relationship had truly changed. I appreciate the invitation, I told him, but I think it's time for you to handle things on your own. You're a grown man with a successful business and 2 wonderful children. You don't need your mother managing your life anymore. Brandon's expression was difficult to read. Relief mixed with something that might have been disappointment or fear. But the kids are used to you being here. Madison especially has become really close to you. And she always will be. But she also needs to see that her father is capable of taking care of his family without depending on others. That's a lesson she needs to learn, and it's one you need to teach her. On the day Brandon and the children moved to Des Moines, I stood on my porch and watched them load their belongings into the moving truck. Madison hugged me tight and made me promise to visit soon. Cooper, still shy but more open than he'd been in months, gave me a handmade card thanking me for making our family better. Brandon was the last to say goodbye. He stood on my porch, looking older and wiser than when he'd arrived 9 months earlier, and for a moment I saw the little boy I'd raised alone in that cramped apartment above the hardware store. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. For saving my children, for teaching me what I needed to learn, for being exactly the mother I didn't deserve but always needed." "You're welcome," I replied. "And Brandon, don't make me remind you again what happens when you forget to be grateful." He smiled at that, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. "I won't forget, Mom. I promise." After they drove away, I went back into my quiet house and sat in my living room, surrounded by the photos and memories of the family I'd fought so hard to protect and rebuild. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace that I had won. Completely and utterly. My son understood his place in our relationship, my grandchildren were safe from toxic influences, and the woman who'd tried to replace me was living in disgrace and poverty. But the victory felt different than I'd expected. Less triumphant, more melancholy. Because in winning the war, I'd had to become someone I wasn't sure I liked, calculating, manipulative, willing to destroy lives to make a point. Still, as I looked at the latest photo Madison had sent from Des Moines, the 3 of them smiling together in their new home, I knew I'd made the right choice. My family was together, my son had learned respect, and my grandchildren had a chance at a stable, healthy life. Sometimes love requires terrible choices. Sometimes protecting the people you care about means becoming the villain in someone else's story. I could live with that knowledge as long as my family was safe. Before I finish this incredible journey with you, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button one more time, and don't forget to ring the notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because the lesson here is one we all need to remember. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about Amelia's choices. Sometimes love looks like revenge, and sometimes family requires the hardest lessons of all. 2 years have passed since Brandon moved to Des Moines with Madison and Cooper, and I can say with complete satisfaction that my victory has only become more complete with time. Every aspect of my carefully orchestrated revenge has produced exactly the results I intended. With interest, Brandon's business in Des Moines is thriving, but he learned to build it the right way this time, through hard work, honest relationships, and careful financial management rather than riding on someone else's connections. Every month, without fail, he sends me a payment toward the money he owes me, along with a handwritten note updating me on his progress and the children's activities. The notes are different from any communication I ever received from him before. Respectful, grateful, acknowledging not just what I did for him recently, but what I sacrificed throughout his entire life. He's finally learned to see me as a person rather than just a resource, and that recognition is worth more than any amount of money. Madison and Cooper visit me every school holiday and spend a month with me each summer. They call me every Sunday evening to tell me about their week, their friends, their accomplishments, and struggles. For the first time in their lives, I'm not just the backup grandmother called in for emergencies. I'm an integral part of their lives, someone they turn to for advice and comfort and celebration. But the sweetest part of my victory is what happened to the people who betrayed me. Vivian Reynolds, aka Beverly Jean Kowalski, is currently serving an 18-month sentence for embezzlement and fraud. The investigation that started with my anonymous tip to her real estate firm uncovered years of creative accounting and client trust fund violations. Her carefully constructed life of luxury was revealed to be built entirely on other people's money, stolen through a complex scheme of false documentation and forged signatures. She's lost everything: her house, her car, her professional license, her social standing, even her health. Prison has not been kind to a woman accustomed to spa treatments and designer clothes. The last photo I saw of her, published in the local newspaper during her sentencing, showed a hollow-eyed woman who looked 20 years older than her actual age. Richard divorced her the moment her criminal charges were filed, taking their remaining assets and moving to Florida, where his name isn't associated with the scandal. He sends Christmas cards to Brandon and the children, but Vivian's name is never mentioned. As for Skylar, my former daughter-in-law learned too late that betraying family has consequences that extend far beyond divorce court. The custody arrangement that gave Brandon primary custody also included provisions about her visitation rights that I helped craft. She can see Madison and Cooper every other weekend and for 1 week during summer vacation, but only if she completes ongoing therapy and maintains stable housing and employment. The therapy requirement has been particularly challenging for someone who is raised by Vivian to believe that manipulation and emotional blackmail are normal family dynamics. Skylar has struggled to unlearn the toxic patterns her mother taught her, to develop genuine relationships with her children rather than trying to use them as weapons against their father. Her housing situation has been even more difficult. After Vivian's arrest, Skylar was left homeless and nearly penniless. She's working as a receptionist at a dental office, living in a studio apartment, driving a used car that breaks down regularly. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle she'd enjoyed during her marriage is gone, replaced by the harsh reality of supporting herself without a wealthy husband or criminal mother to subsidize her expenses. She's tried to reconcile with Brandon multiple times, suggesting that they could rebuild their marriage now that her mother is out of the picture. But Brandon has learned to recognize manipulation, and he's not interested in giving her another chance to destroy his stability. "I feel sorry for her sometimes," he told me during his last visit. "But then I remember how she was willing to sacrifice our children's relationship with their father to please her mother, and I know I made the right choice." "Do the children miss her?" I asked. "They miss the idea of her, the mother they thought they had before everything fell apart. But they don't miss the chaos, the anger, the constant drama. They're happier now than they've been since before the divorce. The children are indeed thriving in ways that justify every harsh choice I made." Madison is on the honor roll at her new school, plays varsity tennis, and has a confidence I never saw when she was walking on eggshells around her mother and grandmother. Cooper has joined the chess club and started taking piano lessons, pursuits that were discouraged in Skylar's house because they weren't cool enough. Most importantly, both children have learned to value genuine relationships over superficial ones. They've seen what happens when people prioritize appearances over substance, when they choose manipulation over honesty. They understand that the grandmother who worked 3 jobs to support their father is more valuable than the one who wore designer clothes bought with stolen money. "Grandma Amelia," Madison said during her last visit, "why didn't you ever tell us about Grammy Viv's problems? You must have known something was wrong." It was a perceptive question from an increasingly mature young woman. I considered my answer carefully. Sometimes adults make mistakes, and children shouldn't have to worry about grown-up problems, I said. But mostly, I wanted your father to learn some important lessons about who he could trust and why. What kind of lessons? That people aren't always what they appear to be. That real class comes from character, not clothes. That the people who love you most are sometimes the ones who look least impressive from the outside. Madison nodded thoughtfully. Like how you look like a regular grandma, but you're actually really smart and tough? I smiled at her perception. Something like that. Your father forgot for a while that the most important relationships in life are built on sacrifice and genuine care, not on appearances and convenience. He had to learn that lesson the hard way. Are you still mad at him? It was a fair question. Was I still angry at Brandon for his betrayal, for wishing another woman had raised him, for taking my sacrifices for granted for so many years?
No, sweetheart.
I'm not mad anymore.
I'm satisfied.
And I was. Completely, thoroughly satisfied in a way that surprised me with its depth and permanence. You see, revenge isn't just about punishment, it's about education. It's about teaching people the true value of what they've discarded, the real cost of their choices, the lasting consequences of treating others with disrespect. Brandon learned that his self-made success was actually built on my foundation. He learned that the sophisticated mother-in-law he preferred was actually a criminal who saw him as an investment to exploit. He learned that rejecting the person who'd sacrificed everything for him left him vulnerable to people who would sacrifice him for their own gain. But most importantly, he learned that love isn't just about feeling good. It's about showing up, being grateful, recognizing sacrifice, and never taking for granted the people who put your well-being before their own. Every month when his payment arrives, every Sunday when he calls, every holiday when he brings the children to visit, Brandon demonstrates that he's internalized these lessons. He's become the son I always deserved but never had, respectful, grateful, aware of what I've given him, and committed to honoring that gift. The woman who tried to replace me is in prison, her life and reputation destroyed beyond repair. The daughter-in-law who supported that replacement is struggling to survive on her own, finally understanding what life looks like without family support. The grandchildren who were being poisoned against their father are now thriving in an environment built on honesty and genuine care. And I live in my modest house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with my cat Churchill and my garden and my books, financially comfortable for the first time in my adult life thanks to Brandon's monthly payments. I volunteer at the library, tend my flowers, host Sunday dinners when the children visit, and sleep peacefully every night, knowing that I've protected my family from people who would have destroyed them. People in town sometimes ask me about Brandon's success, about how proud I must be of his recovery from the business difficulties that brought him home for a while. I smile and agree that I'm very proud of my son, that he's learned important lessons about what really matters in life. They don't need to know the details of how those lessons were taught. They don't need to understand that sometimes love requires terrible choices, that sometimes protecting your family means destroying their enemies, that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply allowing people to experience the full consequences of their own choices. But you understand, don't you? You've followed this journey with me, watched as I systematically dismantled the lives of people who thought they could discard me and replace me with someone more convenient. You've seen what happens when someone underestimates a mother's love and a woman's capacity for strategic thinking. The truth is, I regret nothing. Not the investigation into Vivian's background, not the anonymous tips that started her downfall, not the custody battle that exposed Skylar's manipulation, not the months of careful planning that led to my complete victory, because in the end, this was never really about revenge.
It was about justice.
It was about ensuring that my grandchildren grew up understanding the difference between people who genuinely care about them and people who see them as tools for manipulation. It was about teaching my son that real love comes with obligations, that family loyalty must be reciprocal, that treating people as disposable has consequences. Brandon got exactly what he asked for when he wished Vivian had raised him instead of me. He got to experience what life would have looked like under her guidance: criminal investigation, financial ruin, family destruction, children turned against him by someone who saw them as weapons rather than precious individuals to be protected. The difference is that when Vivian's true nature was revealed, he had no one to turn to for help. No safety net, no unconditional support, no one willing to sacrifice their own interests to save him from the consequences of his poor judgment, except for me. The mother he'd rejected, who loved him enough to save him even after he'd broken my heart. That's the final lesson in all of this. Real love isn't about making people feel good or giving them what they want. Real love is about doing what's necessary to protect them from their own worst impulses, even when it requires you to become the villain in their story. I became that villain willingly, knowing that my son would eventually understand why I'd had to be so ruthless. And now, 2 years later, he does understand. Every month when he sends that payment, every time he thanks me for saving his children, every Sunday when he calls to check on my health and happiness, he's acknowledging that I made the right choice. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who refuse to let you destroy yourself. Sometimes family means holding people accountable for their choices. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is forcing them to face the truth about who they really are and what they really valued. And I gave Brandon all of those gifts, wrapped in the sharp edges of consequence and tied with the ribbon of justice. And in return, I received the respect, gratitude, and genuine relationship I'd always deserved but never demanded. That's not revenge. That's love in its purest, most uncompromising form. So there you have it, beautiful souls. Sometimes love looks like war, sometimes family requires the hardest lessons of all, and sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them fall far enough to remember who's been holding them up all along. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family relationships, if it reminded you to be grateful for the people who sacrifice for you, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember to subscribe to Her True Stories for more incredible journeys of strength, survival, and the power of a woman who refuses to be taken for granted. Until next time, remember, you are never too old, never too small, and never too powerless to demand the respect you deserve.